we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, make sure you hit that bell for notifications if you're watching on YouTube. Like and rate the podcast wherever you listen to it. Tell your friends if you like the podcast and spread the word. If you want to support the podcast, you can go check us out on our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. And then always feel free to reach out to us on our DMs and let us know at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. We'd love to, hear from you guys. Tell us about ideas for the next shows, topics. If you want to come on the podcast, I've been talking to a few people already, trying to get you guys out here. It's awesome. Things are starting to open up a little bit now in Ontario, which is tremendous. I was thinking about the episode today, and it's kind of one of these topics that I've thought about doing for a long time, and it's something that's really near and dear to my heart. And maybe it's a podcast that I might even come back and do a part 2 to or a follow up to, but I didn't want to go over the top with it. I didn't want to get too wild with today's topic, which is, it's all about Pearl Jam. It's all about the band Pearl Jam. One of my favorite bands of all time. I know it's one of my Pops' favorite bands. Shout out Pops. He of course got me into it, and I mean, their first album came out in 1991. I was born in 1991. There's just a lot of nice kind of coincidences kind of happening there, which is great. But, I've kind of just grown up listening to Pearl Jam. And I'd say it's a really, really heavy musical influence on myself, because they were one of those bands they were one of the first bands that I really started caring about kind of what were their early influences. And, there was more information starting to come out, and there was a great documentary that I'll talk about in the podcast that came out too, that gives great insight into the band and to their history and where they came from. Like I said today, I didn't want to get too down in the muck, and I didn't want to get into too much of the individual personalities in the band and their own histories and the bands that they used to be in, and all that stuff, which is, again, like I said, it could be a whole other podcast. But the way I kind of wanted to just talk about Pearl Jam today was use their albums kind of as somewhat of checkpoints throughout their career, so we can kind of use that as a little bit of a structure around who the band is. Because I think to appreciate the band, you kind of have to understand where they came from, and then how that kind of carried on. Because the best place to start is obviously talking about the grunge scene, of the early 90s, coming out of Seattle, coming out of that northwest kind of coastal area of the United States. And, your Nirvanas, your Mudhoneys, your Alice in Chains, Soundgardens, you have all these amazing bands. And of course you have Pearl Jam in there too. And the thing with the grunge scene is that it kind of came out of, without going too far into grunge today, which I could probably do a separate episode on, but one of the biggest things with grunge is that it was this natural evolution, kind of still being in the rock genre, coming out of the 80s, which was like crazy hair metal and glam rock and like really flashy fast metal stuff, and like all that kind of stuff, which is good in its own right. But that evolution came from these dudes in Seattle, where they kind of were taking the punk ethos, which was happening big, but it was very underground at the time, taking that punk ethos of let's do it, but adding a little bit more polish to it. There was a lot of skill behind a lot of these musicians that were in these grunge bands, and they used a lot of that heaviness that was coming out of the 80s, but they also incorporated a lot of more melody and cool chord structures, kind of, that were probably more akin to like 70s rock. So again, it's always interesting the way anything progresses, is that it's almost like a leapfrog effect, right? Something new comes along, and then the next scene is someone taking from a previous generation and adapting it to the new one. It's very interesting as far as music's concerned, and especially the grunge scene, right? So obviously you had Nirvana, which probably landed a little bit more on that hard side of things, but Pearl Jam was essentially the yin to Nirvana's yang, if you want to look at it that way, or yang. Essentially, if you look at it, Pearl Jam could potentially be one of the only bands, because their latest album they've released in 2020, they're probably one of the only remaining bands that is still making music from that time. I mean, I'm sure there's other ones, and I don't want to cast dispersions, but or leave anyone out. But again, you know, they kind of survived their way out of the grunge explosion, because the biggest issue with grunge too is that essentially, like, the music industry friggin' pounced on grunge and essentially grabbed it, took hold of it, enslaved it, and just pushed it back out, polished it up so that they could sell it to everyone. And the next thing you know, the Bay has grunge friggin' clothing and on the cover, and you know, it's just, there's pedals coming out in the music, guitar pedals in the music industry that are just called grunge instead of using the fucking distortion pedal that all the artists would have used anyway. So it started getting too on the nose, and then you started getting into that then at that point, the actual progression from grunge turned into like Creed and Nickelback and stuff. Again, not to cast aspersions ever, but that's where things went when the music industry tried to come in and tried to put a pretty face on it. I guess you could put it that way. But again, you know, that whole Seattle scene with all those bands coming out of it, that was where everyone was coming from. So Pearl Jam formed, a little bit more of the history of the band itself. Pearl Jam formed in Seattle, Washington in 1990, consisting of lead singer Eddie Vedder, rhythm guitarist Stone Gossard, bass player Jeff Ament, lead guitar player Mike McCready. And they started with drummer Dave Abruzzese, and it was a little bit of a Spinal Tap scenario. If anyone's seen Spinal Tap, there is a trope in the music industry of bands going through a lot of drummers. They sometimes, in essence, are interchangeable depending on how it goes, or there's issues, and, you know, replacing a drummer is very difficult. It's extremely hard to replace any member of a band, but replacing a drummer can be doable in some instances, and it depends on the type of guitar player or bass player too. Again, it depends on the scenario, but a lot of bands, the heart and soul comes from the drummer, and if it's not that perfect fit, like the drummer, if you switch them out, it can change that whole feel, the pocket, the way the bass player plays with them. That's one of the most important parts, in essence, is how the bass player and the drummer play together too, right? So there's personality, there's talent, there's skill, there's all these different things that come into having a really good drummer. So they started with Dave Abruzzese, but over the years they actually ended up taking in Matt Cameron, who was Soundgarden's drummer at the time that they formed. So Matt Cameron, tremendous drummer. All these guys, again, I don't want to bog us down too much in the individuals too much, but again, each one of these guys you can take and you can talk about them. Amazing, you know, Stone Gossard's songwriting capabilities and Eddie Vedder's voice, and Jeff Ament's a great bass player, one of my favorite bass players, because he likes to use the melody a lot in a lot of his bass lines, which is great. Mike McCready's one of the greatest guitar players out there. And like I said, Matt Cameron, tremendous drummer. So best place to start is at the beginning. And their first album was called 10, came out in 1991. And in my opinion, it's one of the best debut albums of all time. There's a lot of great debut albums out there. The first Dire Straits album that came out was tremendous. The first, I guess, yeah, I mean, even like you could look at the first Greta Van Fleet album is very, very interesting. But as far as greats are concerned, we're talking about, Pearl Jam. We're talking about Dire Straits. We're talking about, Van Morrison's first album came out. Oh my gosh, amazing. The list goes on. But 10 is amazing. Some of the tracks are Jeremy, Alive, Black, Even Flow. These are all tracks that you still hear today on the radio. They've been playing it since this album came out. So tremendous. They re-released a copy. I'll mention that later, but they kind of like remastered some of the songs, and really, really cool. I got it on vinyl, and it sounds amazing. So the band obviously came out to big success when that album came out, and then when they came out with their sophomore album Versus in 1993, a couple years later, after touring and everything, there's a little bit more pressure on the band, when you're releasing your second album, especially after a first one does the way 10 did. There's a lot of pressure to live up to that, of course, obviously, right? So came out in 1993, and it made it to number 1 on the Billboard charts. And it basically, at this point, really was solidifying Pearl Jam in the music scene. One of the big songs on that album was Daughter. Really, really solid album there. But at this point, again, they're starting to get famous, and they kind of started to get a little bit uncomfortable with fame. And not to go off on too much of a tangent here, but that's kind of a thing that I noticed, is it seemed to be a bit of a theme for artists at this time, or at least artists in this grunge scene, is, they didn't really get into music to become huge and famous. And I think it's somewhat of a side effect of technology and basically how the music business was shifting towards maximizing profit. A lot of these artists didn't really pick up their instrument to become the most famous person in the world. You hear the story of Kurt Cobain saying this all the time, right? Like, he started playing music in his garage because it was an escape from his life, and it was a way to express a lot of his feelings that he had, and a way to be with friends and do his thing. And then, obviously, it's the funniest thing with music, it's hard to say that anyone doesn't, like, if you're going to play live, most of the time you might even just be getting paid a couple bucks, or you might even be drinking for free. But most of the time people think, okay, you're playing music because you want, at least some recognition. You want people to clap for you, whatever it is. You want people to give you credit. It's kind of like, yeah, I guess, but music's also meant to be like heard and listened, or heard and listened to by other people. So it's like, I want to play music, and yeah, I might be able to play some of these songs pretty well, and I sing this song all right. And I think if I sing it in front of people, they're going to enjoy it. And there is something, and there's many artists that approach music that way, and that's it's not only to satisfy their own artistic, itch and scratch that itch, but it is providing a service essentially to people, right? Painting and sculpting and things like that. You don't necessarily have to do that in front of people. You can create it on your own, and then you can present it to people. It's a very different kind of presentation. Whereas music, unless you're listening to an album, live music anyway, it's a live performance, right? It's performance art. So the only way you can actually do it, right? Like when I was playing drums and stuff as a kid, it's fun playing drums on your own, but it's not nearly as fun playing drums with other people. And then if you do it with other people and it's good, it's so much fun to play it in front of people. I never really got to the point where I played drums in a live show, but all the other instruments that I've played live, it's that same thing, is that, wow, this is fun. I like doing this on my own. I'm not too bad, I think. The only way I'm going to ever figure out if I'm any good or not is to actually play this in front of people. And then you get some buddies together, or you go up there on your own, right? Can't tell you how many shows I've gone up and just me and my guitar and played and had fun, because that's what it is. And I guess you could say there's a narcissistic or an ego aspect to some of that, but again, it's meant to be enjoyed. So it calls for it. It's part of playing. And I mean, you can go and you can learn to play any instrument you want with no intent of ever going never the intent. with no intent of ever actually going up on stage and playing it for anyone, and that's totally fine. And you can just keep getting better on your own and meet your own goals and do your thing. But again, especially as a musician like myself that's in bands that we write songs, playing in front of people is crucial because they give you some feedback as well. So anyway, just picking up an instrument doesn't necessarily mean you want to be famous. It means you want people to like your music. But at that point, when billions or millions of people love your music, at a certain point it's no longer in your hands. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these artists, is that they didn't anticipate that, or again, maybe they're fighting with potentially Kurt Cobain's case, or a lot of rock musicians or musicians' case for that matter. There were other issues, drugs and mental health, that kind of contributes to things. But again, that level of fame, I couldn't imagine. I have no idea. I have no clue. And I'm sure a lot of people listening, and most of the people out there, we don't really understand what it's like to be so famous that you can't even go out, you can't even walk down the street without people mobbing you, without people trying to take pictures. When I was in Thailand, I talked about this in the International Children's Game podcast. That's a few episodes back. Anyway, when I was in Thailand playing basketball for Team Hamilton, there were people that would stop and take pictures and ask for autographs and stuff, like people from Bangkok, from Thailand, doing, local people just like surprised that they're seeing like this big, huge white guy. And that was for like 10 days. I couldn't imagine doing that like at a way larger scale anywhere you go, in like fucking Portland or like Toronto or anywhere, right? So it's hard to imagine what it would actually be like, and it's too much for a lot of these artists, right? So I think at the time, when grunge was happening and shifting, and the music industry standards were kind of being shifted, and record company heads really only cared about making money. And that kind of became where they tried to analyze grunge, they tried to break it down, they tried to reproduce it, and then it turned into something else. Meanwhile, all this stuff is happening in the grunge scene. Hip hop is starting to come up. There's a lot of that happening, and there was that crazy story about those people kind of getting together and like altering the course of hip hop, or super strange. Anyway, I believe I talked about that. I talked about that in a few podcasts ago. I'll tag that episode in this podcast on YouTube if you're watching it. But at that point, hip hop's coming up, and like there's also that whole pop scene with like boy bands and girl bands and girl groups and boy groups and solo acts too, right? With MTV all mixed in there, right? So the idea that music was basically, the music industry up until that point was basically albums and live shows, excuse me, and like merchandise, I guess. But with MTV, now all of a sudden you have these music videos, right? And there's a whole new revenue stream there. And essentially with these music videos, we started kind of like blurring the lines of, like back in the day, no one really cared what kind of musician, like what musicians look like. They didn't care what you look like, Name any musician kind of before the 90s. A lot of them weren't necessarily the best looking people. They got dolled up and all that greatness, but not everyone was like a stunner. Not everyone was Prince, not everyone was like Kate Bush or like super, super gorgeous people. There was lots, don't get me wrong, but they all had unique beauty, and a lot of their beauty also came from their artistic endeavors. But no one cared what any musician looked like, really. You could look like a donkey if your music sounded good. It's great. I mean, up until they started making making concerts more available and having that as a big profit margin, doing huge world tours and things like that. Again, most people were just listening to albums, listening to the radio, doing that thing. It wasn't about what the artist looked like. In fact, unless the artist put their picture on the cover of their album or inside the jacket, no one really knew what the artist looked like until they saw them live, if they got to see them live, right? Not everyone that listens to music could go to wherever, New York's Carnegie Hall, and go see some of these people, or wherever it was. You know what I'm saying? So, with MTV coming out, now all of a sudden all these artists have to be on camera, right? And that whole thing kind of shifted into like, maybe their music isn't good, but they look great, or they're hot, or they're sexy, or, you know, they're willing to do things in videos, and they're good actors, or whatever. And then that's contributing to the music sales. And then, you know, obviously things turned into Napster and then all that stuff too, as far as the actual music's concerned, but we won't get into that. And again, with those boy girl groups that I mentioned, kind of thing, you know, record companies were all about getting as much control as possible over the artist and just going with what worked. They're not going to sign any bands that don't fit the model that already works. They're going to go with what works, and the A&R people are just out there to find more of the same thing in a slightly different package. So essentially, you know, it's almost like when we talked about the like performance enhancers, steroids in sports, in that podcast episode a few episodes ago. Essentially, if you want to compete in sport, you have to take steroids in certain circumstances, which is an ethical nightmare. So basically what we're saying here, if you want to play music, then you're going to have to make all these sacrifices and be in front of the camera and be in front of this, where all these people weren't necessarily built, right? So, you know, if you wanted to express yourself and make a living, you can't just like, oh, I'm going to be behind the scenes. Don't get me wrong. There's there's tons of songwriters out there that are behind the scenes and still doing this. Look at Chris Stapleton. He even had to come out though. So, you know, eventually you got to get in front of people, but that's it. But that's what music's all about, right? So, but that level of fame is, like Will Sasso likes to say, fame is an illusion. And it's an illusion because it can be given, it can be taken. It's not really tangible. It's just you know, how the people feel, right? So, and based on that current scenario in the cultural zeitgeist, wherever you might be, if you're not following the rules, you know, if you're not making videos for MTV, and if you're not, you know, doing the TikToks today and being out there, people might not know who you are. And artistic integrity or not, people might never hear about you, right? So that's a weird thing about artistic integrity, I guess, right? Is that at a certain point, are you dumb for not doing what is going to get your name out there? Yeah, it might be quote unquote selling out, but how else are you going to make it unless you do what people like? And yeah, there's classic stuff and there's traditional things, and you can keep pounding and keep doing traditional things, and eventually things will work. But you know, that's the problem with this. That's the problem with the whole thing. And you know, there's a great example, and I always talk about this when the thought of artistic integrity kind of comes up. But at the '96 Grammys, Pearl Jam actually won a Grammy for Best Hard Rock Performance for the song "Spin the Black Circle" off Vitology, which is a couple albums down the road. But essentially the band goes up to receive the Grammy because they all wrote the song. And Eddie went on to speak for the rest of the band, and he got up and said, "I don't know what this means, and I don't think it means anything." And he basically was saying, listen, you guys are giving an award for art. And Jeff Ament in the great Pearl Jam documentary, Pearl Jam 20, says, you know, if I had the balls, I would have said that same thing, because how can you give an award for art? It's something subjective. How can I give an award for something that's subjective, right? So, yeah, it's amazing to get a Grammy. Oh my God, I would probably hit the roof. But at the same time, to see these guys and to see Eddie say something like that and the band back him up 100% in any interview, it's just like Jeff said, Eddie had the balls to fucking say that. And yeah, it's spitting in the face of the music industry essentially, but that's just where that whole grunge ethos and just who Pearl Jam is as artists, or who Pearl Jam are. The members of Pearl Jam are all artists with integrity. Let's just put it that way, right? So you got to respect it. So after the success of Versus, we'll kind of backpedal a bit. They actually decided to stop making videos. So the band didn't want to make any more videos. They made a video for Jeremy and I guess something else, but at that point, they began a boycott of Ticketmaster, which we'll get into right now, because Ticketmaster versus Pearl Jam. This is one of the biggest things. I could probably do a whole separate episode on this, but essentially the Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department, members of it anyway, encouraged Pearl Jam to file an antitrust suit against Ticketmaster. So basically, the suit stemmed from 2 free concerts that Pearl Jam tried to play in Seattle on Labor Day. And Ticketmaster tried to charge Pearl Jam like $1 per ticket, like to print the tickets more or less, and distribute them and sell them and all this stuff. And it's a free concert, right? So they're just like giving out tickets. That's it. So essentially they're saying, look, Ticketmaster has all these hidden deals with all these venues, all these big, huge, giant venues, Madison Square Garden, Staples, what you name it, the biggest fucking places. They have all these deals with Ticketmaster as the primary ticket seller, and Ticketmaster would charge these astronomical service fees. Like, I'm talking $4 or $5 a ticket, and this is like having to be taken up by the band. Like, they're either going to lose that money straight to Ticketmaster, or they're going to have to charge their fans more, right? And these are loyal fans, and at the time too, right? Concerts are like $12, $14, $15, like even in the 90s, man, because albums and CDs were like $20, $25, $30. So like they made most of their money off album sales, pre-Napster and pre-fucking LimeWire and all this stuff. So they didn't want to be gouging people, and this is an opportunity for people to have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to come see their band. They didn't want tickets to be $100 and $150, $300 because no one's ever going to go see a show. We'll get to that in a minute. Pearl Jam, basically, when they launched this suit, they kind of expected all these other bands to kind of step up. There was a lot of their cohort bands that, their comrades, if you will, that were definitely suffering from the same issues they were. And they basically expected all these other bands to step up and support, and basically no one did. Essentially, it was a David and Goliath scenario. Wow, excuse me. Basically, obviously, Goliath being Ticketmaster and David being Pearl Jam, but even if all these bands got together, it would have been a tough one going up against Ticketmaster. However, if all these bands just boycotted Ticketmaster like Pearl Jam did, Ticketmaster would be in a fucking pickle, I'll tell you that much. But unfortunately, because Ticketmaster had all these secret, well, I don't know how secret they were at the time, but had all these deals, these exclusive deals with these big venues, Pearl Jam wasn't allowed to play at these venues. I'm sure there were some other bands that probably boycotted with them, but they just weren't big. So any of these bands that didn't want to use Ticketmaster were fucked. And basically it was just Pearl Jam. So Pearl Jam essentially had to do everything themselves. Sell the tickets, print the tickets, find venues. And like Ticketmaster had deals everywhere, man. Like they were like easily, I don't know how like, Molson, Labatt, like they're in every bar, that kind of idea, right? Like they're in every big venue. So it's kind of one of these things where it's like, yes, obviously Pearl Jam has something behind this with this lawsuit, but they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, right? And essentially, all Pearl Jam wanted was to cap the ticket cost at $18 for the fees, but for the fans, sorry. So they just wanted it to be $18, and Ticketmaster wanted to charge the band $4 a ticket, and the average at the time was $4 to $8 per ticket. So, we're talking at least almost $25 at the time, would have been double what you'd normally pay. So, like I said, Pearl Jam had to do all their shows from scratch. And actually in 1994, Pearl Jam was called to testify before Congress that Ticketmaster actually acted as a monopoly. There was some really good testimony kind of proving that they basically are, and it's true. Like there's I think they at least controlled at least 70% of all the ticket sales. So they were again, it's tough. There's a lot of laws protecting these big companies too that are crazy loopholes. So essentially Congress determined that Ticketmaster wasn't breaching any antitrust laws, and the case was closed in July 1995. If more artists joined the boycott, would it have helped? Like we said, could have. Ticketmaster could have been put in their place a little bit, and maybe there could have been a better compromise. But essentially, Pearl Jam was going, listen, we just don't want these ticket sales people to become an even bigger conglomeration and then start selling tickets for $150, $300 a piece because of all these fees, and they're the only place you can get tickets. Well, surprise, surprise, looks like they fucking predicted the future, because Live Nation and Ticketmaster are now one, and now what are we doing? We're paying $300 to go see the Black Keys. So, boys, I love you, but, what are we doing? And I'm paying for Spotify right now. I'm sorry, I'm not pirating your music. I know you're only getting 8 cents a fucking million plays or whatever the shit, but the fucking shows are too much, man. The shows are just way, way too much, people. And this is what happened. You guys. Fucking Michael Stipe or whoever could have stepped up. Somebody could have stepped up and helped these boys back then. But hey, now we're fucking paying mad dough. So anyway, I mentioned Vitology already, but their third album came out in 94. So this was kind of like amongst all this madness. One of the great songs from that album is Better Man, and that's Vitology's Andy Dwyer's favorite Pearl Jam album. He has a hat that he was wearing the first time he ever heard that, and he would never get rid of that hat. So obviously, during this time, 94, 96 era, they're kind of fighting Ticketmaster and doing these crazy tours. And I think Jeff Ament said, or Matt Cameron said, it was really hard on the band, the having to do everything themselves, right? So listen, obviously Ticketmaster is necessary, people, but the gouging is crazy. These fees, what do you mean fees? What? Seriously, you got to print the tickets. Yeah, sure. We'll pay for that. You got to sell the tickets, no problem. But what are we talking about here, man? Service charges, nuts. Fucking bots are buying tickets. I busted my ass to trying to get Pearl Jam tickets when they were going to play here in Hamilton. Fucking bullshit. So anyway, through all that nonsense, they came out with their fourth album, No Code. Came out in 96. It's kind of the band's least favorite album. At least, I don't know about all the band, but Mike McCready said he thinks the album cover is better than the whole album itself. I don't think it's that bad of an album, but, it's probably one of those things, as a band, especially as a band that has the longevity, and, a band like Pearl Jam's been around for like 30 years now. I'm sure every album that you make kind of becomes like a bit of a home movie almost for that time in your life, right? So maybe that's kind of why they're not the biggest fan of it. Took them a couple more years. 98 their fifth album came out. They dropped Yield. Really good album there. Kind of brought the band back to their original sound. It reached number 2 on the charts, which is really good. But one of the more interesting things from that is Do the Evolution, which is a phenomenal song off that album, was their first music video since 1992. And it's funny, I don't know if it was their agents or whatever, or, it just sounded like at this point, Pearl Jam kind of had enough and just had to kind of dance with the devil, because they also went back to working with Ticketmaster and went on a full-scale tour. But one of the most interesting things about that Do the Evolution video, which everyone should go check out, go watch it on YouTube, it basically doesn't show the band. It's a cartoon. It's a really cool cartoon, kind of like MacFarlane-esque kind of cartoonism. Not Seth MacFarlane, but kind of like that Spawn, edgy, kind of like alternative art from the late 90s, or late 90s at that point. And they didn't even show the band. It was all cartoon, right? So it's like kind of funny that Pearl Jam probably was thinking about like, how can we make this music video without us having to fucking be in it? Because they just weren't down. If they had to do a music video, they were more for, let's do like a concept thing, right? Instead of just like, the band fucking rocking. Although, nothing wrong with that either, right? So anyway, really cool approach. Just doing the cartoon of the video. From that tour, they created a live album called Live on Two Legs, which is a really good live album. Live albums are super interesting. They've been around forever, and it gives you another kind of listen to the song. Obviously, you can't really be there in person, but obviously live, there's different little eccentricities and different little quirks that the artists come up with when they do the song, and sometimes they only exist in that moment, right? Like they'll never be reproduced by the band. It was an accident. It just happened in the moment, and you're able to listen to that. Really good. So that came out later in 98. In 99, Pearl Jam released a cover of the 60s ballad Last Kiss. It was actually originally done by J. Frank Wilson, and it's actually Pearl Jam's highest charting single. And then that kind of brought them into 2000, and they released their 6th album, Binaural. And in that one, they were really experimenting with some really cool recording techniques. If you listen to the song Nothing As It Seems, you can kind of hear some of the stuff that they were messing with. On the Binaural tour, they actually recorded every show and released 70 official bootleg albums. So I really love that about Pearl Jam, is they actually do the recording and release bootlegs that are really high quality. They sell them, but like, hey, smart play. Someone might be in there with a fucking recorder, but it ain't going to sound as good as the recording straight from the board from Pearl Jam. So really cool idea. I think, more bands should do that. So a couple years later, they released their 7th album, Riot Act. Really cool album. It's kind of a little bit of a blend of folk and art rock sounds. They were pretty, America was in a really rough spot kind of post 9/11. And, I feel, Pearl Jam's kind of a band that's really in touch with what's going on. And it's interesting, the music that was coming out at that point. Because in 2003, the band actually released a song called Man of the Hour, which was for the soundtrack of Tim Burton's film Big Fish, which is a great film. And that was their first release without a label. So, really cool. Band's able to kind of branch out and do their own thing and work with Tim Burton and get that song out there. Very good song. I remember just me and my one buddy listening to that song. You just kind of get lost into it. It's they did it on Pearl Jam performed it on one of their live albums, Live at Benaroya Hall, which is a great album. And the live performance is haunting. It's very good. So after that first release without the label, it actually was a few years before they came out with their 8th album, Pearl Jam, their self-titled album. It's kind of funny. It took them 8 albums to have a self-titled album, which I respect. So that came out in 2006, and it was their first album with J Records, which is one of Clive Davis's record companies. And on that album tour, when the band was playing it, that was actually my first Pearl Jam concert I went to. So I went with my pops. I'm not sure. I think Andrea was there, maybe. Danny Casuccio potentially. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I forget, because I was entranced. It was the show. Like I had really liked Pearl Jam up until that point. I had liked Pearl Jam up until that point because I had listened to them so much, and obviously my pops was really interested in them. But the show was actually in Toronto on at Air Canada Centre at the time, on May 10th, 2006, so a day after my dad's birthday, May 10th. So I was in grade 9 at the time, was still in school. And I remember going and, I was like, oh yeah, going to see Pearl Jam. It's going to be fun. And that night after the show, I was like, I fucking love Pearl Jam and I will love Pearl Jam for the rest of my life. Again, just the way the whole band plays to the crowd, and the way Eddie is as a front man, and the way he carries the whole thing. And he just makes you feel like you're right there. He sings to the whole crowd. And that's that whole 70s ethos, right? I remember hearing the lead singer of Iron Maiden, Bruce Dickinson. He was talking about when you're singing to the crowd, no matter how big the fucking place is, you want to find the guy that's in the fucking very back, and say, you, and sing right to the guy. And he's going to stand there and go, me? Yeah. And just like you sing right to that guy, and then everyone in between is going to feel that, right? So that whole idea of just playing to the crowd and loving the crowd, and, everyone singing every word. And, there are people that go to these shows. Like, there's people that have seen like over 100 Pearl Jam shows. Like, they travel like the Grateful Dead. They travel like the Fish the Fish. They travel like Fish fans and go and travel with the band that way. So it's like, there's something really, really special about Pearl Jam fans, and it was very, very cool vibe. And I love it. And I have a poster from the concert in the living room. Their 9th album came out 3 years later, called Backspacer. Really good. That was kind of me graduating high school at that point. And it was released on their own album, Monkey Wrench Records. And it was kind of more pop and new wave influenced. Really good album. Some cool songs on there. Around that time, they also re-released 10, like I mentioned, on a deluxe set and on vinyl and everything. And then they released deluxe versions of Verses and Vitology. And then in 2011, they came out with the documentary Pearl Jam 20, which is actually directed by Cameron Crowe, the same guy who did Almost Famous, which is basically based on his life, where he was a Rolling Stone writer. So he's a really cool guy to do the movie. And he used over 12,000 hours of footage from the band over the years and put that all together. And it's a very, very good kind of retrospective, really, really thorough kind of look at the history, or at least the 20-year history at that point of Pearl Jam. Now they're in their 30th years now. 31, I guess they've been around for now. Jeez. Their 10th album came out in 2013, Lightning Bolt, which is a great album, which is the shirt I'm wearing. I'm wearing this shirt from the tour because me and Pops actually went to that. Me and Pops and Andrea went down to Pittsburgh, and my dad was is in the Pearl Jam, or the 10 Club, which is like their fan club, and he was in there for a while. And a lot of the fans in there, you get like priority. You still have to buy the ticket, but you get like priority for a lot of like the seats that they're trying to get rid of, or like the really good seats at certain events. So the Pittsburgh show came up, and Pittsburgh's like about 4 or 5 hour drive from Hamilton, not too far. And so we drove down, and we didn't really know where the tickets were. We know we had tickets, and Pops said, I think he had already paid for them, but we just knew that they were ready. There was 2. Andrea didn't come to the show. It was just Pops and I. But we go to Will Call that day to pick up the tickets, and we're looking at the tickets, and, we're excited to see where they're going to be. And we're thinking, they're going to be in the bleeds. They weren't all that expensive. It was kind of like these exclusive, we got the tickets. It was great, but we had no idea where they're going to be. So we're looking at the tickets, trying to find out. And it says FLR. And we're like, are these floor seats? So they turned out to be like in the 25th or 30th row on the floor. Tremendous. Oh my God. Amazing experience. It was at the Console Energy Center, which is where the Penguins play. It was just like huge, like really interesting. I've only seen a few big, huge shows where you're on the floor. You really feel the entire crowd kind of like all the cheering is kind of like coming at you. It's very, very cool. They had a wicked poster, obviously Pittsburgh being the Steel City. And I loved that was my first time in Pittsburgh. I went down with one of my bands over the years, but I love the city. Very similar to Hamilton, Ontario, obviously being a steel city and everything. But the cool thing with Pearl Jam too is what they do is they get an artist to do a poster for basically each one of their shows, and I have it hanging here in the studio, and it's really cool. I'll show you guys a picture right now, but as you see, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it right now. But if you're listening, it's a really, really cool kind of like Steel City vibe, perfect kind of homage to the show, and it has all the date and everything on it. It's just a really, really cool poster. My dad built this really awesome frame around it. But like I said, if you're watching on YouTube, you just saw it there. But I'm sure you could go check it out. The show was October 11th, 2013. So if you look that up in Pittsburgh and try and find the poster, because I think Pearl Jam has an archive of all their poster artwork, which is so cool. And it's actually funny because essentially, I don't know if it's not necessarily that same tour, but basically almost the year to the date, so October 16th, 2014, the next year, me and my brother B-Ry actually went down to Detroit to go see Pearl Jam again. Now, the tickets came up. We went down because our buddy Greg Dawson, shout out Dudley Dawson, Gregski. He lives in Windsor, so we knew we could go chill with Gregski for a bit, crash at his place, and go to the show. And you can like take the city bus across to Detroit, which is super easy. It was friggin' wild. I had never experienced it, but it was an experience. And it's so easy to get across. Boom, tickety boo. You don't have to park anywhere. And it was at this show was at Joe Louis. So right before they tore down Joe Louis too. So it was really cool to see a show there. But the cool thing about that show was it wasn't on the Lightning Bolt tour. It was like an off-album tour. I guess they just wanted to kind of keep playing. And it's really cool seeing a band do their show when they're kind of promoting an album. You know, they're obviously going to play a lot of new songs and stuff, but when it's an off-album show, especially a band like Pearl Jam that has so many songs that everyone loves, the set lists are just so cool. They tend to be just like amazing greatest hits. You know, sometimes they might not even play a new song, right? So it was amazing. Me and B-Ry had a fucking hell of a time. It was great. They played such great songs, and that was an amazing show. They had a really cool Joe Louis poster, and I think a Pavel Datsuk kind of poster thing. I didn't get any because there weren't any. I think at that point, I think I got a cool little pin there though, which is still in my backpack. But yeah, tremendous show. And again, that's the cool thing about any band that does those off album shows. If you can, go check those out because they're basically going to play like their greatest hits, which is so cool. Their latest album, their 11th album, Gigaton, came out in 2020. And one of their songs on there is called Dance of the Clairvoyance, and I guess it was their big single, but it's a really cool song, super cool for Pearl Jam. It's kind of a Devo, and there's a really cool movie with Robin Williams from the 90s called Toys, and there was a song that they did in there that was a really cool kind of new wave vibe. But you can really hear it in that song, and I love it. I think it's a really cool departure from some of the stuff or it's not a departure, I should say. They're more focusing into that kind of new wave aspect of their sound, and very, very cool. And I was busting my ass to try to get tickets to that show too, because they actually were going to play at First Ontario Centre here at Copps Coliseum in Hamilton, but it got canceled due to COVID. So I guess I didn't miss anything, but fuck, that was a bummer. Pearl Jam is kind of one of those bands that, you know, they're always involved in charitable events too. they got involved with Neil Young. They kind of call Neil Young the grandfather of grunge, and they really took a liking, and Neil Young took a liking to Pearl Jam, the band, and they did an album called Mirror Ball in the early 90s. And Neil Young also always puts on this show called the Bridge School Benefit Show. It's show about, I don't think it's only for autism awareness, but it's to support the Bridge School in New York City. And he puts those shows on, and Pearl Jam is always involved in those. And I think Pearl Jam really took that kind of vibe, and even that U2 kind of Bono humanitarian vibe really to heart. And they're amazing with their charitable contributions. They're always doing amazing things with charities. You've probably seen me in another Pearl Jam shirt that kind of looked like the Batman logo. That was for homeless teens. The Benaroya Hall album that they did was a benefit for children. So again, they're always involved with all these charities, which essentially that with their with their persistence in supporting these causes, because that's what it is. They keep at it. There's always something where, and when they tell you too, like, hey, some of the money from this ticket that you bought is going to go to a great cause. Like that's what brings all these people together. That's what brings the crowd together, I feel. And the band themselves, their willingness to evolve as musicians, I think all that combined is what kind of has ensured Pearl Jam's relevance to this day. And they have fans from all over the world that go to dozens of shows and support a band they love. And I think the fans love the band, and I think the band love the fans back. They're really good. Again, they'll play to the house lights come on. They'll take a fine from the venue that they didn't leave when they were supposed to keep playing to the fans, because the fans love it and they drink it in, and it's amazing. And as an artist, it's beautiful to see. And bands are really hard to keep together and to manage and to do all that stuff, but there's bands like Pearl Jam out there that are an inspiration to artists like me, and I hope they're an inspiration to anyone who listens to them. And for whatever you're doing, you don't have to be a musician to be inspired by these guys. They keep putting it out there. They keep working hard. They do it for the fans, and that's what I would always want to do in my bands too, right? So, keep doing whatever you're doing. If whatever pursuit it might be, keep that integrity. Do it the way you want to do it. Understand that, yeah, maybe there's some times you're going to have to bend a little bit, but never break. Look at Pearl Jam. Look at Eddie talking to the fucking Grammys, telling them basically to fuck off and say, listen, this doesn't mean shit. It's a fucking award for art. Art is subjective, and art really what it counts is where it comes from. And if it comes from the heart, that's all that matters. So go out there, be like Pearl Jam, get in the even flow and keep going. And remember, always tell a friend, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. Hit us up in the DMs if you ever need anything. Hit that bell. Subscribe to the channel on YouTube. Pass that around on everyone. We want to keep growing that channel. Everything's been going great on YouTube. I love all the watchers on there. I think it's interesting, right? Doing the video versus the audio, but again, we love doing this for you. And if you want to support the podcast and keep it going, hit us up on our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. There's lots of tiers there that you can contribute to. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you. If you've never listened to Pearl Jam before and you've listened to this entire podcast, go and listen to their whole catalog right now. There's amazing songs out there, and there's always going to be something there to speak to your soul, because they're an amazing band and everyone should appreciate them. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pearl Jam. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Doot 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 doot. Peace.